Today I want to talk about a concept that I believe in fairly well just because of the statistical reasoning behind it, and I'm hoping I can convince you as well because hopefully it gives you more of a positive outlook on crystals overall as you play this game, because good or bad, luck in Marvel Concept of Champions is a short-term illusion. It's a perception illusion, and that luck isn't actually there, right? Like, it feels good or feels bad when you see like back-to-back God Tier champions, or feels bad when you see back-to-back meme champions. But Marvel Concept of Champions isn't a game where you like spin one 5-star crystal and that's it. You'll never spin another 5-star crystal again. Or you spin 8 5-star crystals and that's it. You'll never see another 5-star crystal again. You keep on going. You play the game, you stick around for a long period of time, and you will get God Tiers. It's inevitable. As long as you are continuing to play the game, the inevitability of you pulling a God Tier eventually is present. Now, whether or not you think it's frequent enough, whether or not you think it's accessible, those are all different issues. I'm not trying to point out that it's accessible or reasonable or easily to obtain with like a paywall, all that jazz. I'm not trying to contest that. I'm just stating that as you play the game, the concept that you will get lucky or be unlucky in pulling God Tiers doesn't exist. It's the fact that it's just RNG, and the statistical probability is all about averages. It's all about averages and quantity of crystals pulled. So in order to really explain this, I need to point out two statistical theories, and the first one is the law of large numbers. And the law of large numbers is the theory that as you conduct an experiment, let's say a die roll of 1 through 6 perhaps, when you roll the die at first, the distribution or the average roll of that dice will initially be a large standard deviation, right? Like if you roll a dice 6 times, you could see 1 all 6 times, and now your average is 1 on a die 1 through 6, which is totally whack because it should be 1 out of 6 times you roll a 1. You immediately go, die is rigged. But if you roll that dice 1,000 times, the distribution changes, and suddenly you start seeing it shift more towards the average of 1/6. When you roll at 10,000, it gets pushed closer and closer to an average of 1/6, until eventually you roll it ad nauseum an infinite amount of times. You see an even distribution of 1/6 across the board for all 6 sides of the dice. And the lower number of die rolls you have, the farther and farther you can theoretically be from that average and be reasonable. So that's the first one, and then the second one is the law of averages. And the law of averages is the principle that supposes most future events are likely to balance any past deviations from a presumed average. So essentially, the law of averages is that if you keep on rolling a dice, the number of times you will roll 1 is 1/6. That's the average number of times, and it might not be 1/6 at first, but it will get there eventually. And these two laws kind of coexist with each other. They're statistically relevant to coexist, but you need to know those two laws because I'll be talking about them going forward. So first off, I want to point out the 1 through 6 example exactly. So if I roll this dice here, and this will track it over time, if I roll it 1 time, you see I get a 5. If I roll it 10 more times, I've still yet to get a 1 here. This is just lucky. This is full RNG. You might say, man, I rolled a dice 11 times, and I didn't roll a 1 a single time, and I rolled 2 4 times. That's absurd, but it's really not, because in a short period of time, this is actually really reasonable. But if I roll another 10 times, you see here by the number of 21 rolls, we start to see more of a spread. But still, the difference between 3 rolls and 1 roll here is 5 and 2. And you see here too, where I previously had 4 rolls, is still at 4 rolls, 10 rolls later. And it's not until you start spinning like 10,000 times that you see a distribution here. But even if I do 10, 10, and then 100 here, you can see here, even after 120 rolls, you have this huge disparity between like 4 and 1, 26 and 15, and this is the perception, right? The perception is, oh, let's say, just for this example, anything 5 and 6 is a God Tier champion, and anything 1 and 2 is a meme tier champion. Or let's flip it, right? Maybe that's the perception. 1 and 2 are God Tiers, and 5 and 6 are meme tiers. From this perception, you would look at your rolls and you would say, man, it feels like I've been unlucky. When in reality, you just haven't rolled enough. You know, spin 10,000 more times, and suddenly your luck is the same as everybody else's. You're just at a different stage, and that concept is really, really important in a game like MCOC. Because while luck is super relevant at first, this distribution is incredibly important at first. As you play the game, as you progress, as you open more and more crystals, you can know and you can say for certain that you will eventually reach this statistical average. And again, if you have an issue with how long it takes to get there, if you have an issue with the accessibility of these crystals, that's a different complaint. I'm just saying, if you're upset about your luck, or you're upset about your first pull or your second pull, I think you're focusing on the wrong thing. Because a major part of MCOC is that the game is static. You get that character and you get to keep them. You get that character and you get to use it to push arena, or push the rating of your champion pool, or maybe level up a defender here or there. And that static growth is really a big part of MCOC, where even meme champions still earn points in arena. And maybe you're not an arena grinder, but that doesn't change the fact that there is a value for meme champions. That value exists whether or not you take advantage of it. Whether or not you think it's a reasonable value for the champion, it still exists. It's still present. And here we kind of shift into a different kind of a issue, where it's less so about the actual distribution of champions, because I think I've pointed out clear enough that it's inevitable you will see God tier champions, and now it becomes a question of how defined this distribution is on where the God tier champions are and where you need them. Because if you come across a node and 1/6 of the champions answer the node, it's actually really reasonable for Kabam to be like, no, you should have a defined answer for that node, and if you don't have 1 in 6 of those, you haven't pulled enough. Because after 100 pulls, you definitely have 1/6 of those. After 10 pulls, you might be missing a specific node, you don't have a response, but even after 20, you have at least 1 response in your arsenal. Maybe not the response you like, but it's there, and you just have to keep pulling if you're looking for a better one, but that response exists. It's when the distribution becomes different. Let's say we up it to 3 dice here, and you spin 100 dice. Even after 100 times, there's still no 1, 2, or 3. So if we're looking at a distribution of 3/18 or 1/18 of the champions answer a node, that's when it gets a little more dicey, if Kabam is expecting you to have 1 out of 18 champions in order to handle a node, 100 rules is an actually large amount, where it's just hey Kabam, we don't have that many 5-star champions to do in the first place. And you might say, okay, 100 is semi-reasonable, but I spend 200 here and still no 1 out of 3. Perfectly reasonable chance in the RNG. And again, keep in mind this is distributed up, where 1 and 2 are impossible, so it's actually just 3. So the probability here is just a little different. It's just for showing purposes. It's very, very skewed since it's adding these 3 dice. I couldn't get a different kind of probability distribution here. But let's say you're closer to the end of the 4 or the 18, because this will inevitably approach a normal curve where it's balanced in the middle. But let's say you're approaching the 3 of the 18, the 4 of the 18, where there's a very small pool of champions who answer a node. That's when the balance is skewed. And Kabam, what they need to do is they need to strive to be more towards the center here, where a great amount of champions answer nodes, so you can feel good about it. And then it's all about applying multiple utility to champions across the board, and then limiting the pools based on individual pools. So any one champion might have 4 different utilities, but only one of their utilities might be useful. And then you limit it based on those utilities, and then progress forward. And it gets very, very complicated the more you dive into split utilities, needing both poison and fury, caustic temper. There's just not a ton of answers for that at the moment. So splitting the utility in that way isn't super reasonable. But what if I said something like, hey, you have to bring a male character and they have to be science? There's a lot of options for that. Those exist in the game. Or maybe you say you have to play skill, science, or mutant, or you have to have class advantage, right? That's a whole different thing. And suddenly you've already set it on a 1/6, you set this bar, and you can limit it accordingly and make it reasonable. And that balance is something Kabam needs to do in order to make this kind of distribution, this 1 dice distribution of reasonability, fair. That brings me up to my next point here, is the quantity of champions in a game and the likelihood of you pulling any one in a given instance. So let me refresh this page. So this is a 100-sided dice, which is pretty close to the number of champions we have in the game. And I'm like, what happens if you roll 100-sided dice 1,000 times? So we'll hit roll. and I'll show the stats. So these are the stats of those rules, and I apologize, it's not like super close. So if you see here, like any champion here, 10, we see 15. If I just scroll through, we see a 2. Like, so as high as 15, as low as 2. I'm just going to scan real quick, see if we see anything crazy. So yeah, so as low as 2, as high as 15. Sorry, this is within 100 rules. I thought it was 1,000, but I guess it only showed me 100. So just within 100 rules, we saw as big a disparity as 15 and 2. So the next time you're like, hey, I pulled this meme champion 8 times, remember that RNG-wise, that's actually really reasonable. What's important, again, for the continuity of the game and the longevity of the game is that Kabam doesn't put in nodes where out of 100 champions, only 2 champions answer. Because even after 100 rules, you still might not see that champion. Just because the way RNG works, you might not get it. But if 10 champions answer a node, it's perfectly reasonable. And as frustrating as it is, if you don't have one of those 10 champions, it's still balanced. It's still reasonable to say, hey, you just haven't hit the number of rules reasonable to reach that 1/10. And juggling that probability versus the limitations of roster selections is a whole challenge in itself, and that's a whole different topic. I just wanted to point out that inevitably, if you roll enough times and you keep on playing the game, you will get what you're looking for. It might be a long time from now, and it might not be what you want, but you will get it. Like, the difference between hunting for a Nullify champion, Doom, Symbiote Supreme, Clairvoyant, Hood, is very, very different than spinning for Doom, right? You're looking at a 4 times difference in probability there. So that's it. That's my whole shtick. A little long-winded, kind of went off a little track, but it's something I really, really wanted to talk about, get your feedback on. Again, remember, this isn't about the inaccessibility of crystals. It isn't about, all that jazz. It's about the fact that when you spin 5-star crystals, don't get too hung up on whether or not your individual 5-star was good. Get hung up on whether or not you're pulling good 5 stars at all. And when you pull a new one, or you're fishing for a new shard or a new crystal, remember that it's not about, is this next crystal going to be the god tier, but it's about knowing that you just are farming up the inevitable. You are prepping for the inevitable god tier pull you're going to get. So one meme pull is just one more step towards that law of averages, because that is an inevitability in the game. So I hope that mindset really helps. Let me know what y'all think, and I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.